Hello and welcome. My name is Margit Bantowsky. I am a Trillium Awakening teacher and a transformative coach. Trillium Awakening is a spiritual path that integrates consciousness, embodiment, and mutuality, the field of interbeing and relatedness. And today's topic is transmuting guilt and shame. And I want to explore how guilt and shame are related to what I call awakened activism, and how we can work with these powerful emotions. So, in my experience, awakened activism, as it matures, as we deepen in our awakening, and as we integrate our conditioning and shadow parts and become more authentic, awakened activism, as it evolves and we mature, our motivation to engage and to act is sourced and rooted more and more from a fundamental trust in life, and also sourced in a sense of authenticity, authentic responses from my organism as it's webbed into the collective field. So in awakened activism, trust is a foundation, and authentic response is a way of participating with others in relationship. And although love can be a really powerful driver for many activists, traditional activism tends to be sourced and motivated or driven by fear, this anxious fear energetic, which can also drive anger. And the other thing that it can drive is sort of a gestalt or energetic of guilt and shame. How many letters do we get in the mail asking for money, and how many of those kind of use guilt and shame as part of an attempt to get us to act? So that energetic, I'm going to try to unravel for us a bit. And so we're ultimately more able to come from an authentic and trusting place and responsive place, rather than a lot of fear and guilt and shoulds being the driver of our action. So one of the, I'm sure all of you can sense this and have experienced this, how guilt and shame can lead. There's sort of two typical ways, if you look at it as a polarity, that on one end of the spectrum, too much guilt and shame can cause us to collapse. We can get immobilized, depressed, frozen even, and really low energy. On the other end of the spectrum, we can be so triggered by guilt and shame that it is, instead of hypo action, which is depressed action, hyper action, where we push ourselves so hard we overcompensate to exhaustion, and we might push others to exhaustion as well. So when we're unclear about guilt and shame in our system, and when we're driven by guilt and shame in our system, we can go into collapse and non-responsiveness, or we can over-respond and be driven and drive ourselves and others to exhaustion. Now, guilt and shame are not bad things in and of themselves. It's human. I'm human. You're human. We're all human. And these are normal emotions. I don't want to pathologize these emotions. They contain a lot of wisdom and potential for healing and potential for relatedness. So instead of eliminating, we need to unpack them, see how they affect our ability to respond authentically in a sustained way, and learn to uncover the intelligence underneath. So in my graduate program, the mantra was exploration before explanation. So before I go into sort of my take on all of this in more detail, I'm going to invite you to first to find your own sense of the answers to these three questions. And by doing so, you'll have more fertile ground with which to receive some of the things that I'm going to offer you. So the first question is, what are some ways that you avoid feeling guilt and shame? What are some ways that you avoid feeling guilt and shame? Just take a moment to do some journaling around that question. If you're watching this as a video, go ahead and push pause and give yourself as much time as you'd like. In what ways do you avoid feeling guilt and shame? What do you do to not feel that? Great. Now, the second question I'm going to invite you to contemplate. What's your sense of what's the hidden wisdom underneath guilt and shame? Guilt and shame were to contain some gold in them. What would the gold be? What's the hidden wisdom or gift within guilt and shame? So go ahead and take some time to reflect on that. The third and final journaling question for now is, how might you gain access to that wisdom, to that gold, to the gifts? How might you gain access to that? What would you have to do to reach the gifts underneath guilt and shame? So I'm going to now share with you some of my thoughts about guilt and shame, and then we'll go into some guided meditations as well to take some of these ideas more deeply into our experience. So the first thing I want to point out or suggest is that guilt and shame are both emotions that involve our relationship with others. So guilt can be seen as a response that I have inside myself to having harmed someone or something. It means I have some access to empathy and remorse. So sociopaths might not actually have this capacity. They don't have access to empathy. But to the degree I have access to empathy, something inside my organism knows something's a little off. I've just caused harm. And there's some remorse, some feeling of, oh, that doesn't feel right. Something doesn't feel right having caused that hurt. Even though I might, in other parts of my personality, say I'm completely justified. There's this place that says, boy, that's not right. That doesn't feel good. And guilt looks at my action. Like, my action was, you can use the word bad. I don't like to use it quite that way. But guilt will admit that my action was hurtful. In contrast, shame goes all the way into my personhood. So shame gets activated when I experience others as judging me for being flawed, for being wrong, for being bad, for being found lacking. Shame may also arise when I judge myself that way. So shame is a way of turning against myself inwardly and taking it on as an identity, as my personhood. I am bad. I am wrong. I am hurtful. Guilt can ooze into shame depending on what our wounding and our patterning is and our self-belief system. But I want to tease out the difference between the two. Guilt being an appropriate response through empathy, a recognition of harmful behavior, whereas shame takes it all the way in and makes the assumption that I'm a bad person. So both guilt and shame can be distorted, can be turned into distortions and result in unhealthy motivations in awakened activism and, acting in the world. Especially when I try to fix these uncomfortable feelings without digesting them more fully. If I avoid them, it's going to come out sideways, and we'll do all sorts of contortions to avoid feeling those things. And I'll go into that more detail in just a moment. I also want to suggest that transmuting or finding the gold in these emotions cannot be done by the mind. The mind can be co-opted by our defense mechanisms and be used to justify all sorts of things. And the mind will not shift necessarily the deeper root of what's underneath some of these feelings that we need to get to in order to get to the gold. We have to include our bodies and our hearts, our access to compassion and empathy, and our body. So how do we transmute guilt or access the wisdom within guilt? The first step, I suggest, is I was going to say the first step is feeling compassion for the other. Sometimes we can't feel compassion for the other until we first feel compassion for ourselves. So there are two steps, and depending on who you are and what the moment is, one might be more easily accessible than the other. One of the steps is feeling compassion for the other person. This is empathy. So allowing ourselves to sense into the suffering of the other person, their pain, their hurt. After allowing ourselves to take in their suffering, there may be a wave of grief under that. Genuine sadness for the way in which they are hurting. And, this is healthy empathy, sensing their pain and feeling sadness, grief about their pain. The neurotic distortion that can happen around guilt is taking too much responsibility for the other person's suffering. So those of us with some sort of Christian overlay, probably are pretty familiar with that. So taking too much responsibility is a distortion of empathy that can wreak havoc for us. This other step, second step, or first, depending on how it works for you, is empathy for the self. Compassion for what it was that motivated my action that caused that suffering for the other person or other thing, being, property, animal. Compassion for my limits, for my failings, for whatever motivated that movement, that action. After holding myself with a lot of compassion, there might be grief. There might be grief for my failings, grief for my limitations, grief for my inability to have prevented that suffering and that harm that I caused. So these two pieces are critical. So feeling compassion for the other and grief, sadness, and then compassion for the self. And then underneath that, the grief and sadness. And in holding both simultaneously, ultimately, that transmutes the dynamic, like holding the whole exchange with compassion, allows the possibility for me with eyes open and heart open to see things clearly. After that, I can allow myself to sense into the next steps for repair. what is the next action that I need to take in order to repair the relationship, the breach in the relationship. So this process, compassion for self, compassion for other, holding it really deeply and truthfully with eyes wide open, allows the impulse for repair to emerge in some sense of what steps to take. So this whole process I consider as intrinsic to integrity, accessing integrity, knowing what integrity is. So another way of saying it is that healthy guilt is a way of sensing when something is off in relationship and creating a doorway for repair when we hold that deeply and sense into the root, the deep exchange that happened. So, I'll give you an example in my own life. So in my partnership with my husband, sometimes I'm tired and irritable and I can be a little harsh, and that can be hurtful. And if he doesn't say something right away, he's pretty good at telling me, that when I've overstepped, my respect for him, his self-respect. But if that doesn't happen, ultimately at some point there will be a place in me that says, that didn't sit well, that doesn't feel good. I allow myself to feel the harm that I caused for him. I also hold myself with compassion. It's like, I was tired and it just came out really bad. And then by holding that in myself, I can, make repair. I'll go to him and say, you know what, sweetie, I'm really sorry I snapped at you. That was an unfair thing for me to do. You asked a perfectly valid question, and I was really impatient with you. And man, that was not cool. From I'm not perfect at this. When I don't go and metabolize my guilt, I can get defensive and I can start dismissing him and saying, you're too sensitive. You shouldn't have come into the kitchen when I was cooking. I will justify my position. I will make him wrong, blame him for my inconvenience. So if I don't sense into that compass of guilt, then I cannot do the repair. And in that case, when I'm defensive, the first thing I need to do then is hold myself with compassion. And then after holding myself with compassion, then I might be able to hold him with compassion and then open up for repair. If we're too other identified, I might be feeling really guilty about him and then, overcompensate and over placate and over accommodate. So in that case, I might need to spend some more time holding myself with compassion and clarity, and then come into right repair without dismissing my end of the bargain. So without holding both parties with that compassionate place, the guilt can be distorted into overcompensation, over placating, or I'm free of guilt and you're the wrong person. So shame is a slightly different animal. Guilt can slip into shame, and we'll look at that in a moment, but it is fundamentally different. And some people who've studied shame have argued that shame is actually the most painful emotion of all. And at its root, shame has to do with falling from grace. The body gesture of shame is the lack of eye contact. So the first thing that happens is the gaze goes down, which means I break relationship. I am outcast. My eyes are downcast and I am outcast from the other or from the collective. And in that casting out, I am bad. I am what's wrong. It's self-negating. So Brene Brown, there's a quote that I used in the, marketing this particular talk today. Shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change. That's by Brene Brown. So shame, it's almost like an indelible ink stain, means I'm bad, I'm irreparable, is the underneath sense of it. And it means that I can't, there's no redemption, right? Shame kind of pushes out beyond the edge of redemption, unredeemable. So when we're overly identified with shame, and I have been for much of my life, crippled with debilitating self-hatred and self-revulsion, which is all shame, is an expression of shame. And it can be really hard to get below this. So there's this kind of preemptive self-flagellation that happens. And I can't access my innate goodness. So what happens when I'm collapsed in shame, I cannot hear the other person. I do it to myself before I hear their truth. So there's no, actually, when I am collapsed and identified with shame, there's no room for the other person's truth in my field. So it disconnects relationship. It makes no room for the other person. And when I'm over-identified with shame, I can't access my own goodness. So in terms of activism, if I'm over-identified with shame, I might do everything possible to prove that I'm good, or I might just completely collapse into depression and not be very functional and not be very useful. And I might actually even oscillate between the two. So Gershon Kaufman wrote this beautiful book about shame, and there's another one, I'm forgetting his name, called Shame and Pride. So there's a polarity that tends to set up with shame, which is collapsed, oh shit, I'm horrible and I'm a bad person. But that's intolerable. And so the other side can be inflation, which is pride, which is narcissism. So those of us who have had narcissistic people in our lives know all about that. It's a very shame-based dynamic. So if I can't tolerate the feeling of shame, I'm going to be shiny. I'm going to, prove that I'm really good. I'm going to be the best activist. I'm going to be the best environmentalist. I'm going to be so socially correct that you can't find any fault with me. And that, of course, is exhausting and unsustainable. And it's also really off-putting because I say, I'm good, you're bad. My goodness is based on making other people bad. So both the collapse in shame and the compensation for shame by pride are really corrosive and ineffectual ways to engage activism, engage responding to the world's suffering. So, like transmuting guilt, where holding ourselves and the other in compassion is part of the work. With shame, it's the same thing but on steroids, but it's self-directed. Because shame is self-negation, the antidote is deep self-love. And sometimes we can't do that on our own. Sometimes, like, I needed to lean into tremendous compassion from my therapists and Trillium teachers until I could start offering myself the depth of self-love needed to transmute shame. And we take it from the original surface layer triggering event, the shame, and follow that shame taproot all the way back to the original imprint. So I'm just going to give you an example again. So with my husband, I might feel guilty for having snapped at him in the kitchen. And if it's done in a healthy way, that is a healthy guilt. I recognize my trespass. I hold myself and him with compassion and maybe even humor, and we do some repair. And I can do that now. In the past, that guilt would then trip me into a shame spiral where, oh my God, I'm a bad person. I'm unworthy of love. I don't deserve this loving man who cares for me. I'm a piece of shit. Um, it'll tank me all the way down to the bottom. So this is, just showing you how healthy shame, and if it's not taken care, if I haven't done my healthy guilt and if I haven't done my shame work, boom, it takes me into that dark place. So I want to do a brief meditation with you. And in this meditation, we'll explore a taproot. And of course, with any guided meditation, please only do what feels right for you. If this feels like too much, don't go there. If you're feeling okay about proceeding, go ahead. So just really staying close to your own experience and honoring and trusting your own experience. This is just an invitation. So I invite you to close your eyes and take some deep breaths and settle in to your body as best you're able. So in the first couple of breaths, just noticing any tension in your body. And with the exhales, releasing the tension as best you're able. Not about perfection. Just releasing the tension. And deepening that release by giving your density, your weight, over to the chair that you're sitting in or the couch. In other words, there's a way in which you've been holding yourself together and holding yourself up, and I invite you to surrender into the chair, into the couch or floor, and letting yourself be held. Subtle shift from holding to being held. Noticing the space around your body, temperature, energy of the room, the sense of the room. Now bringing awareness to the surface of your body, how your clothes hit contact between your body and the chair. Sensation of being held, knowing that underneath the chair, underneath the floor is the earth who's been holding you since the day you were born. Going now from the surface inside yourself, primarily being aware of your core, so the throat, chest, belly area. And I'm inviting you to remember a fairly recent moment where you experienced some shame. Could be guilt, but allowing that guilt to go a little deeper into a sense of shame, where you feel like, oh, I'm actually kind of a bad person in that way. And if the word bad doesn't resonate, just maybe a sense of regret for how you are, who you are in that way. So noticing how that feels in your body, how that feeling bad about yourself registers in your body. There's a felt sense that goes along with that sense of shame. It could be a tightening in your chest, or a sort of a concave sense in your belly caving in. Whatever it is for you, just noticing how shame lives in your body, what it feels like. The quality of it, physically and emotionally. Now that you've registered that physical, emotional, felt sense of shame that came up in that instance, this recent situation, allow yourself to remember another recent time where you felt the exact same sensation, feeling, that same felt sense. What was the time before this time where you felt exactly the same way? And letting yourself remember that situation, that earlier situation. Using the body, that felt sense, and the emotional quality as your reference point. And having made contact with that earlier memory, just acknowledging that. Now letting yourself go back even further in time to a previous event before that one, an even earlier time where you felt the exact same feeling, the same sensation and emotion, that same quality of feeling. Not using your mind to go to that memory, just letting the memory emerge organically. Allowing yourself to remember that moment, that same moment of shame, that quality. And again, let's do this again, going even further back in time to a much younger time, to where you experience that same feeling, that same quality in your body, the emotion, that quality of shame. Letting that memory bubble up without having to force it. Letting yourself remember that earlier moment. We had the same experience, same quality of feeling. And now I'm going to let you do this a few more times on your own, so that you go back all the way to the origin of this quality of feeling of shame. Somewhere in your childhood. Allowing yourself, as just trusting what emerges, allowing yourself to go back in time even further. far back as you're able, as far back as what comes to you. Just noticing how old you are, what's your age, what's the situation of this really young place, the original experience or one of the original early experiences of shame. Just letting that young you, your young self, show you what it was like from their experience, from their point of view. And your job is just to hold that young self with tremendous compassion and understanding. In other words, not trying to change how that young self feels. Instead, you're receiving fully the experience of that young self with deep compassion and understanding. You're letting that young self show you what was unbearable about that experience. It's been wanting to share this with you for a very long time, and now you're gifting it with your loving presence and patience and understanding. And it gets to show you how hard it was to feel so much shame about itself. Just letting that healing happen as long as you need. If you're watching this on the video, you can push pause and just give yourself all the time you want to hold that young self with compassion and let this wave move through. So in offering your young self compassion and understanding, you can say something like, of course you made the assumption that, blah, dot, 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 fill in the blank. Of course you made the assumption that there was something wrong with you. Of course you made the assumption that you were bad. Whatever that belief was for you, letting the young self know it's totally understandable it would come to that conclusion about itself. And then letting it show you how hard it's been to live with that belief about itself for so long. How that belief has impacted you through the course of your life. With a lot of compassion. And as you sit with that young self, allowing allowing yourself to sense the essential innocence at the heart of your young being, the essential preciousness and innocence of your young self. And then letting that young self know that if there's anything more that it wants to show you in the future, you'll come back and make room for its voice, its perspective. Sensing if this is an okay time to stop for now, knowing that you'll make yourself available in the future to hear its voice. And before shifting out, I invite you to ask and invite a sense of what is it that wants to be remembered from this journey that you just took? What doesn't want to be forgotten? So letting that organically emerge for you. It could be a phrase, an image, a sensation. What wants to be remembered from this contact with your young self? Allowing yourself to know this, to anchor it in your being. And now giving yourself a moment to appreciate your body and your body's intelligence. We began with the body, your felt sense of shame. The emotional and sensory quality is what led you all the way back to this important place. Just giving thanks for the intelligence of your somato-imaginal process, your body's wisdom. Becoming aware now of the space around you. Your body in the chair or couch or floor, bed. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes, and if you want to take a moment to make some notes about your experience, go ahead and do that. Take a minute or two to jot down what wants to be remembered from this journey. Okay, so in closing, I have some final comments to make here. So this is, one way to transmute shame, going to the taproot of it. Inevitably, addressing guilt and shame in terms of activism and responding to the world and the suffering around us, part of where it will take us and can take us is to, the core condition of being incarnated in an imperfect body in an imperfect world. So there may come a point of deep recognition that no matter how hard I try, I can't stop all the suffering, right? So the magnitude of the suffering can be overwhelming. The shame about the inability to address the suffering can be overwhelming. And there comes to a point where ultimately there's sort of an existential reckoning at the heart of all of this that will be asked of us, where there, to encounter the grief of seeing all the suffering, and then the grief of not being able to do very much about it, right? And then through grief, acceptance, and then coming to that recognition that I'm finite, but I'll still do my part. I'll do what I'm able. I'll do what my uniqueness wants to give to the world. I'll do it perfectly imperfectly, perfectly imperfectly. And that's just the deal. And that somehow that's enough. It's enough and it's never enough, right? So that paradox of enough and never enough. So I just wanted to name sort of that existential core of guilt, shame that we might need to do some work around before being more liberated to show up in a different way. And so in conclusion, I'll just say, some of the benefits of metabolizing guilt and shame. Healthy guilt gives us a sense of integrity, helps us stay in relationship, take responsibility for our actions, and stay connected to others, more access to love and exchange. And also this transmutation of shame allows me to be less defended. So as we're less defended, we're more responsive, more genuine care, more genuine compassion, an ability to honor our limits. So we don't take on too much responsibility or too little. There's that sweet spot of being a responsible adult without carrying the whole world on our shoulders. And then being authentic, the joy and freedom to do my part in it and trust that my part is my part, and I can do that with joy and generosity and freedom, and ultimately more sustainable engagement in the world, not so much burnout. I'm going to do a closing poem, and this is a beautiful short poem by Alfred Lamott called Gentle. A gentler world begins in the way you touch your heart. Be soft with the light inside you. Caress your body with this breath. God is nothing else but the place where the sun comes up in your chest. You are the glimmering destination. You are the golden honey daubed on the bread of the ordinary. Whatever is perfect, whatever is heavenly, begins here. May you be gentle and courageous and joyful and passionate. Good being with you. Bye for now.